The book I have right now is like a short story collection, and that was, several years worth of stories. I usually have a lot of narratives on the go. Yeah, I do tend to work at like a pretty steady pace, and I am constantly juggling a few projects at once. And yeah, I also don't want to like overplay what there's a lot going on. Like having a book lost in the shuffle was certainly not the worst thing in the world, and not even the worst thing to happen to me at that time. So yeah, but yeah, I am kind of like used to the whole publishing schedule, and I try to kind of stick to a pretty rigorous schedule myself, just for my own. I just work best when I keep myself at a certain pace.
Are you full-time cartooning at this point?
Yeah, I juggle between like personal projects, which are comics, and then commercial illustration, which is a grab bag of different types of gigs.
At what point in the process were you able to actually do the art thing full-time?
I started working art full time once I had a job in animation for a while, so I got hired as a prop designer on Adventure Time back when that was on the air. I was there for about, I guess, I can't remember how many seasons, but I was there for a little while, up until the show ended. That was the first time I'd worked full time. I was able to like quit dishwashing once I got that job, and then after the show ended, I started gradually picking up more freelance work.
It's been amazing to see over the past, I would say, probably 10 to 12 years. A huge number of the indie alternative cartoonists that I know are basically making a living off of animation. I mean, it seems to be a complete game changer, because obviously, a small percentage, if any, cartoonists are able to make a living just completely off of comics these days.
Yeah, like I don't really know that many people who can just do comics. It usually ends up being, which I think is common with like a lot of artists, is like a grab bag of things. But animation, for me at least, was like really huge in representing just like a even just having a steady paycheck, because I'm more used to the rhythms of freelancing, but obviously freelancing like changes month to month, week to week sometimes. Animation, just like knowing kind of reliably like what your next month will look like, or what hopefully 6 months would look like, was like a pretty big deal, and one that I think is like, for me, I really found valuable.
What do you mean when you say kind of reliable? I mean, how strict of a structure is it when you're working on a network cartoon show?
Oh, it was really strict. I only meant kind of reliable in that like your show could get canceled. So, yeah.
In the way that, like, any job could potentially go away at any moment. I don't think that there was too much of a chance of Adventure Time being canceled, at least in those days. I
Yeah,
mean, it
well,
was.
I mean, I can't get into it too much, I don't think, but like it was a little bit of a surprise when it ended when it did. I think we all anticipated a few more seasons than we did. And like I'm lucky that I had that thing for as many years as I did, because obviously shows don't have that long a run regularly too. So, but yeah, like obviously I'm so out of the like I've never even like lived in LA, and I've never worked in the studio. So I also like I only have this one very specific job experience, and then a lot of like the other ups and downs of animation I haven't really experienced. So
That must have been a conversation that you had. I mean, assume that when you're applying for a job, like a Cartoon Network show, that they probably want you to move to Los Angeles. Was that just not something that interests you?
part of it was that when they were staffing, like I already came on a little late. I came on season 3, and they were already interested in working with people from like different experiences, and like who didn't just cut their teeth in animation. Like they wanted, someone with illustration from comics, and then they could teach the animation stuff later, because I had no formal training. And I was like a lot of other staffers who were kind of the same. Our background wasn't animation. And I think because of that, they were like willing to be kind of flexible. And at that point, they had already had one or two storyboard artists and designers working remotely. So I think like once they found it worked for a few people, they realized like, oh, I can just do this for large portions of our staff. And I didn't have to the responsibilities I had on the job. It wasn't actually important that I be there in person for like all the face-to-face meetings. Like I mostly just had to talk to a few people a lot rather than the whole team a lot. So yeah, it was never like a big thing, and I never wanted to move to LA. Not both because I like Toronto, but I also don't know how to drive, and I feel like that would be very difficult to get around LA that way.
Is a job like that when you're working with what is essentially someone else's vision, or at least a lot of other people's visions, and working again With a studio on what is ostensibly a children's TV show, is it still creatively fulfilling?
It was like there were weeks when it was a slog, and it was you're just drawing boring things. Like I was doing like props and effects. So there are definitely some weeks where it's just like I'm drawing like a car from 5 different angles, and it's just really difficult and tedious. But they did let me like run wild a few times, and I think that was what made it like a pretty unique job to work on. Was that they tried to task artists with things that they think they could bring their own voice to. Um, Rather than just pick up people they know could conform to a house style, they actually like let me do concept art or would assign me things outside of my normal set of responsibilities if they did think that if they did want me to bring my own voice to it. And they did that throughout. Like I think most of the artists who worked on the show, even if they were just in design or just in storyboards, would end up sometimes swapping to both when it became just when it came up. Like I did a lot of concept art even though that wasn't my normal mode, and I worked in storyboards and did title cards and lots of like odd jobs.
House style is, I mean, it's an interesting idea with a show like that. I assume that even, in spite of the fact that, again, they're drawing from what sounds like a diverse group of artists and people like you who work in indie comics who obviously like have perhaps different sensibilities, but there is sort of still kind of an overarching house style, right? I mean, there is like an Adventure Time style, and you do
Mhm.
ultimately need to adhere to that to some degree.
Oh yeah, totally. And that was tough to get used to. I think what helped too is like Adventure Time more than some other shows. I think because of its setting, like it being this sort of fantasy setting, it's like a little flexible. And that's both the, part of the vision of the creators, but then being able to like make stuff up as you go, or the show being able to make things up as it go, it makes it just easier to fold in different aesthetics versus something like I really like the look of Bob's Burgers, but that's um, less flexible like a world. You can't just like inject new influences in without it standing out or without there being a reason for it.
Although tedious, it sounds like doing things like drawing cars would come relatively naturally to you because, I mean, your stuff does often feature a lot of technical aspects. I mean, was that something you were easy to adapt to?
No, that was really tough for me. Part of it was like I like getting into like weird detail stuff, but I'm not good at technical drawing. Like that had to be really like forced and something I learned on the job because I think part of it is also like I never because I didn't go to art school. I never had like the was never forced to do the very rigorous like look at a car and figure out how to draw a car or like do a very detailed architectural drawing. Like I think some artists do get that like very specific technical training and precise drawing skill, because I was always just making like my own comics and zines. If there was something that I didn't feel like drawing or didn't want to learn how to draw, I would just decide to cut it out of my comic. Like I never wanted to like learn how to draw a bike, so I just for a while had comics that didn't have bicycles in them until I felt like I wanted to learn how to draw it. So really being forced to like being assigned like, hey, you have to draw a car engine, look at a car engine and draw it. That was like my first time I actually got that type of like assignment. So it was a steep learning curve for me, and I people I worked under changed throughout the years, but like I really credit them for helping me learn very basic technical drawing skills.
Do you feel like that's had a marked impact on your comics work?
Yeah, it's made me more confident in a cartoonist, and but I also found that like working in animation, I would because the nature of that show in particular, like it's tethered to space and time in a very specific way. You can't, like you have to be very precise about your drawings, and they have to exist in a three-dimensional world and have depth to them. It kind of almost made me push my comics in the opposite direction, and it made me feel more confident to make my comics more abstract and more loose, and push bodies and forms in ways that make sense in comics that you can't do in animation, and kind of break rules of space and time that you can't really pull off in a show like Adventure Time. So it almost made me push my comics like in the opposite direction, which I thought was funny to see. When I look back at it, I can see like as I was getting better at technical drawing, my comics were featuring less and less technical drawing.
I tend to think of your work as being pretty loose and not particularly tied to anything linear. That seems like it's always been, to at least to some degree, a characteristic of your comics, but you just feel like that's intensified as you've done this animation work.
Yeah, and I do think some of it too comes with confidence that all cartoonists kind of have as they keep going. Where when I look at like really early work of mine, like early issues of a series I did called Lose, it's very like I can see how I was trying to go for more technical flourishes and like show off a little bit. And it's because I felt like I had something to prove. I wasn't super confident. I thought I could hide some kind of structural flaws in my drawing with like wild details and all that sort of thing. But once you keep going, you can like feel more confident letting a drawing be simple and minimal. You become more elegant, a cartoonist. And I think that arc is very clear. And like, that's usually the arc of most cartoonists. It's like rarely that they get more and more precise. Like, there are examples of that, but it's usually like they get more loose. And like, anyone from like Jack Kirby to Jaime Hernandez or like Chester Brown. I think there's like a big element of that in Linda Barry's work. Like I think it's you see that a lot of like just people's comfort level getting relaxed throughout their careers. And I think that's been the case for me.
Kirby's an interesting case because I think Kirby, in this specific instance, probably parallels your work more than those other examples because he got looser as he had fewer as he didn't have to deal with the system as much anymore, right? I mean, he was working within the strict structures of these comics companies, and it's once he left Marvel, he wasn't at DC, but once he left Marvel, he started doing the really weird stuff, and it was almost like he had this like he was backed up when he did it, you know. I guess the closest analogy I could think of in the non-comic side is when the Beatles broke up, George Harrison releases this like 4 record album because he's got all of this stuff that he wasn't able to do within that system.
Oh yeah, and the Kirby stuff when he's just like really going wild. Like the 2001 series is like my favorite Kirby work, and like also knowing that like I think that was when he started doing the pages where he wasn't really laying them out that much beforehand. He was just like starting on like the upper left-hand corner of the page and like finishing it that way, which is completely maniacal to imagine anyone drawing a page that way. But yeah, that's like so inspiring to me of just watching someone putting so much of themselves on the page in these like really idiosyncratic ways.
How much prep work goes into one of your pages?
At this point, not. I have like a very loose skeleton, but not much besides that. I don't do very much like kind of penciling or underdrawing or whatever. I work I work mostly digitally right now, so whatever the equivalent of penciling would be, I guess. I do very little of that now, and that's another thing. When I started, I had very like intricate, worked over preliminaries, and now I don't feel like I need that, and I can just kind of work things out as I go.
When did you move to digital?
Midway between at some point when working on like lose number three, so it's been a while, and there are occasions where like I'll have roughs that I will scan, but it's pretty rare. I do most of it on the computer now.
Was that a difficult transition?
It wasn't, only because the line I was going for beforehand, like my pen line was already pretty thin and dead. Like I don't like having a lot of I like having kind of like a deadline, and I don't want much variation of like width in my line. And that's very easy to replicate a computer. It's almost easier for me to get that effect on the computer. It is easier for me to get that effect with like my Wacom tablet than it is when I hold a pen. And it would have been different than yeah, if I was trying to like replicate this like very expressive brushstroke or something. Obviously artists are able to do that, but like I didn't have to figure that out, so it was a pretty seamless transition for me.
It's interesting that you're able to go full digital when it comes to actually making the work, but you seem to be somebody who's still very much invested in, I mean, obviously in print, right? You've got all these books coming out. You're working with publishers. What's your sense of the reason for that? I don't know if disconnect is the right word, but what's your sense for why your approaches are so different between the creation and the presentation?
I think it's just that's how I still prefer to read. I can't read on a screen that well. Like I do sometimes, like but for like extended narratives, I actually like have a hard time focusing that long. I think just the usual screen thing of there being too much pieces of information competing for my attention. And I also just like the way books look and the way books are designed. I've gotten so used to like designing pages that are supposed to like look a certain way when you hold it in your hand and show up a certain way when you like turn a page. It's supposed to grab your eye at a particular panel. And that's just like how I'm used to laying things out. I do put a lot of work online, and like I do think of that as like an easy way to get stuff out there, knowing that is some people's preference. But my personal preference is always for print, so I'd have a hard time giving that up, even though I am doing like web comics and posting things on different like platforms online.
Would you say generally that you're kind of wary about new technology? Because obviously that's how it plays out in a lot of your work, right? A lot of sort of the dystopian, especially your last book, a lot of the dystopian ideals are based around technology gone wrong.
I feel like it's not that I am anti-technology, and like I don't feel like I'm like a luddite or anything, but I was interested, for a book like Familiar Face and some of the shorts in the new book. I'm interested in just like we take a lot of aspects of technology for granted, and we tend to think a lot of developments in tech as being neutral and that they can be used for like good purposes or evil purposes. And I think most people would agree like we're using it more for evil purposes, and that's like so much of media. I'm trying to write about how nothing is neutral, and the way tech has developed has been like in very specific ways. It's usually developed that way because of capitalism and something like surveillance or data collection or whatever. Like there's not a good or bad. Data collection is like not neutral, and like same with elements of like social media or whatever, and there are ideologies embedded within all of these technologies. And I was influenced a lot by like different writers who write about this, Sherry Turkle, Adam Greenfield. And I feel like people get hung up on the idea of like tech being like trying to find the good applications for it, but we take it for granted that tech has like developed a certain way naturally when it hasn't. It's developed this way because particular interests and ideologies have guided its development. A daily strip I do called Birds of Maine, a lot of that is about utopian bird technology, and I was trying to like write an alternate history of that has developed more equitably, and like an internet that has developed to be as liberatory as early internet proponents sort of said it would be.
My main job is at TechCrunch. So I write about it every day. Yeah, I write about robotics, which are obviously both sides of the coin. My sense of it is that in a vacuum, tech is agnostic, but I think what you're getting at here is that you can't divorce it from the powers that created it and the kind of immediate co-opting of things. One of the things I wanted to talk to you about, because it's one of the things that everybody is talking about right now, are NFTs, and I saw that you tweeted something about it, and I think it was right on the money. My sense of it is that I know a lot of people are getting excited about it, and I think that probably some artists will get lucky and will make a killing off of it, and that's great, but nothing stays that way for long, right? Nothing benefits the non powerful people for very long.
Yeah, the NFT thing is like I, I've been very vocally kind of against and but I think even if you put aside all the environmental damage it's doing, which is a huge thing to put aside, like they are so cartoonishly wasteful that is like a very
The
hard thing to
data
put aside.
mining that's required to do any sort of like blockchain or cryptocurrency.
But even putting aside that, I don't really see why people who are correctly critical of the fact that the fine art market is so, unstable and unsustainable and only benefits usually like a small group of already successful artists and is controlled by a group of speculators who are super rich and just looking for places to park their cash. I don't see why someone who is a proponent of NFT or they could look at that market and criticize it and then just want to replace it with a new version of that with like a slightly different group of rich speculators. It seems like such a like I kind of get why I see the appeal of like artists seeing a speculation bubble and just wanting to cash in quick. But the idea that this is like supposed to be some liberating or revolutionary intervention to it's just creating a new crappy art market. Like why would we want to be beholden to another version of this?
Honestly, I think a lot of it's from the artist's perspective. I think it's desperation, because we were talking about this earlier, that it's just, and I talked to really successful cartoonists. I had Dan Clowes on the show, and like he's still selling his originals. Like that's how he's making his money, right? He is
Mhm.
probably the best known alternative cartoonist in the world, and he's selling his originals. It's just not feasible. I mean, especially, you're living in Toronto, I'm in New York. Anybody who's in a major metropolitan city, there's just no way to survive making your art. So I think anytime something like this comes along, there's a brief moment of hope that like maybe there will be a way for people to actually make money on art.
Yeah. And I get again, I get the thing of like, you see a bubble or a gold rush. I see the appeal. I understand it. But once I just think it's like, yeah, even like I think the environmental damage is like too unconscionable to even make it an option. But even setting aside that, it's like, if we're going to focus our energy on trying to like build opportunities for us, like this isn't it. This is just more bubbles, more instability, more like having our livelihoods in the hands of a bunch of rich people who don't really care about us, who just will only ever see us as commodities. And like I don't want to waste energy building that. I don't want to waste energy finding like what the best version of that is. Like no version of that is ideal. That's what we've already had for so long. So I get it, but I don't like it.
I don't want to be too bleak about it, or put too fine a point on it, but I mean, isn't putting your fortune in the hands of rich people who don't really care about you just how you survive in a capitalist society? Isn't there just there's like some form of that, and basically it's at the end of the day you have to figure out which lily pad you're going to jump to.
Yeah, but that's why I mean, like, this is still a new thing, which is why it's like we're already we're already working in this crappy existing thing. We're already working in capitalism, and me personally, I want to build communism. I don't want to build capitalism too. So if we're like choosing what we're going to devote our energies to, yeah, I don't want to waste time on capitalism too. I don't want to fine tune what that will look like. Like people are the rich people are already doing that for us. We don't have to like take part in that. And so that's where I'm at with it.
It'd be nice to scam a rich person, though, wouldn't it? I mean, wouldn't it be nice though to feel like you're at least for like a brief shining moment getting something over on someone?
Oh yeah, I mean, we always get like these little brief moments like that, but I try to put them in perspective. Like watching the GameStop stuff happen. Like I was a little more, like I didn't think of that as like some revolutionary moment, but obviously it was thrilling to see like a few people get ripped off who deserve to get ripped off. And yeah, I'm still able to like take joy in seeing that as fleeting joy whenever that happens. So
That is a pretty good recent microcosm of probably how NFT is going to play out. Few people got it over, but man, there's a dead man break to all their dead man switch to all of this. There's so many fail safes in place should something go up the tracks that like just at the end of the day, no one who isn't supposed to make out for something is ultimately going to make out from it.
yeah, like I haven't really seen I know it's happening, but like already most of the people benefiting the most from the NFT stuff are artists who already are very established and like have high profile careers and sales, or people who already have a lot of money and are just, yeah, looking at it as a new place to speculate or a new place to park cash. Like the fact that we're already at a point where it's like Grimes and whatever Kings of Leon or something are on board. It's kind of like this is already uncool. This is art like whatever the party was, the party's over now. Like Grimes isn't on
Yeah,
it.
it's cool for people who think Elon Musk is cool. It's like
Yeah,
people who like were excited about GameStop because memes.
yeah. Like once the Kings of Leon show up at your party, you want to leave the party, right? Like that's this seems like obvious to me, but
It's funny that it happens. It just happens at such an accelerated pace now because like as far as I know, they were the first band to do an NFT. It was just like immediately the least cool band in the world, short of like U2 doing an NFT.
yeah. I like how quickly it went from, someone who only like has follows whatever is happening. I have no interest in crypto aside from like sometimes criticizing it. So as someone who didn't follow it closely, it was interesting how quickly it went from being like confusing to kind of like intriguing to horrifying to just being like hopelessly uncool. And that like I feel like that happened in the course of like a month. So
Is part of following this stuff ultimately getting material for your work? I mean, are you when you're looking at something like NFTs, are you looking at it through the lens of potentially having it be an element of a future book?
Sometimes I feel like I that stuff just happens naturally. And actually lately, I feel as though things are developing at such a pace that it's kind of hard to. I feel like any satire I write now is already going to be hopelessly dated in like 6 months, and like any kind of goof I do on technology really quickly is gets made obsolete by like something that is way more horrifying or way more absurd than anything I could have possibly like conceived of in like my little science fiction satire scenario. So sometimes I'm almost like actively trying to avoid writing about things directly because like just the all the cliches of like it being very difficult to top reality right now. Yeah, some of it, for NFT specifically, like it's just it's a thing that the entire I tried my best to like not pay attention to it and just think of it as something that will like something that I found distasteful and kind of frightening, the ecological use kind of frightening, but would like come and go really quickly. But it was just it has been a big conversation in the art world, so it was a little unavoidable.
For me, it's one of the very few instances where my day job writing about technology and the interest that I have in comics and the stuff that I do around comics were actually like intersecting. It's interesting to see. Obviously, there are other implications, but it's interesting to see like Matt Fury pop up in one of these stories.
Hmm.
Because it's like I don't know. I guess there's a notion that if you're able to sort of like tokenize something, then you can own it in a different way, and that maybe it wouldn't have spun out. But I mean, it is unavoidable. This is the first time I remember seeing all of the cartoonists that I follow on Twitter like talking about something tech related.
Yeah, it's yeah, and I guess yeah, Fury would. It was Matt Fury, like the whatever the Pepe cards and stuff was like the first time I had heard of it personally. And yeah, it's interesting to see, and also as someone who's like interested in both in like figuring out sustainable ways artists can make a living, and interested in like organizing artists and all of our collective, political education. Seeing these conversations play out has been very compelling, and I think it's like an important thing that we all really consider and talk out the ethical implications of.
Is part of writing sci-fi for you? Is part of it attempting to kind of get out in front of that curve to some degree that all this stuff isn't going to be completely dated by the time the book comes out?
I don't know. I've been thinking about this, like working through 2020 and at 2021 is like really quickly feeling like anything that I had written prior to 2020 feeling really dated, and knowing that anything I was working on in the moment um, is going to feel really dated and probably like really cringy and embarrassing. And I'm still not sure how much I want to like just lean into it or not. We've already seen like waves of pandemic art. Some is like really bad and corny, and some of it is like really great. But I assume in every case, like it will not age well. I don't know if that's a huge problem. Like I don't maybe like I'm trying to adjust to the idea of like not caring about how stuff ages. And my like I do a daily comic right now where I'm like it feels so in the moment, especially because I'm explicitly writing about a utopia while living through like dystopian times. I feel like that's me leaning into it the most because no version of that won't look um, dated in a few years.
I think a lot of it has to do with specificity. I'm actually struggling to think of good art that's come out of the pandemic that's like specifically references the pandemic. I mean, in comics, the one thing that like jumps out is I think Emily Flake was doing some really interesting stuff. Her like
Mm.
long form New Yorker and cartoons, but it was about social distancing and isolation, and those are like, I mean, in a sense, like even prior to the pandemic, aren't those just the logical conclusion of the direction that we've already kind of been moving in with technology?
Yeah, and I think it's kind of telling that like I feel like the big pandemic novel for everyone was Severance, which I love, but obviously was written before she didn't know coronavirus was going to happen. But it's like the most that was like on everyone's reading list and everyone's book club, and it really did capture the feeling of 2020 extremely well, like more than I think anything made that year.
Do you think there's a way to sort of tackle the abstract emotional implications of something like this that isn't just like, here's my pandemic book?
I don't know. I really, I'm not. I think we're gonna see like a range of stuff, and it's also gonna like change the way like the narrative consensus of what coronavirus is, and I don't I can't tell. Like there's all the obvious things. We're going to be subjected to a lot of like really bad novels about like couples breaking up in coronavirus and things like that. And then I'm sure like some very excellent and then also some very like horrible things written about the 2020 uprising. Seeing people try to cash in on that in really cynical ways. You can already see. Yeah, like lately I've been watching art from like the Bush era, and some of it was unintentional. It kind of came out of like for some reason deciding I wanted to watch all of the Saw movies in like a 2 week span, which I got no joy out of. Like I don't enjoy the Saw movies at all, but they feel so much like this is the Bush era of things. But then watching like other movies made at that time that capture like different aspects of what like living through the quote unquote war on terror was like has been interesting because they all do feel really dated, and some of them are excellent, some of them aren't. Today I like watched what's it called, Day Night by Julia Locktev. I maybe got the name wrong, but it's about a suicide bomber who like has 2 days on this very like specific mission, but like just the things that are like really reacting to the moment, and finding some of them really powerful still, despite the fact that they're like are reacting to a very specific place and time. And I actually don't know if someone watching that movie um, who like was born after September 11th, or like was not kind of cognizant during that time period would appreciate what it's doing. And I don't think that's a fault of the movies that it is like that specific.
It's interesting that we've like so quickly moved on to how the pandemic will probably in some be bad for art, because we've just moved on from how bad the Trump years will be for art. Because I feel the same way. I mean, I feel like, I do think that this idea, I know it was coined by the right wing, but like I do think that the idea of Trump derangement syndrome is actually very real, from the standpoint that I think that, like, I mean, obviously you're in Canada, so you're slightly removed from it, but it's still North America, and you're still next door, and all these things still have massive implications on the country up there. But I do think that like something like that just completely breaks our collective brain, and I and everything just becomes so directly, when when you feel like you're dealing with trauma, everything just is such a direct reference to that trauma. And I think ultimately a lot of the art just ends up coming out the other end just being kind of cliche.
Yeah, I mean, I remember in the moment after Trump was elected, already being annoyed at everyone predicting the slew of great art that was going to be produced.
All the great comedy that we were supposed to get.
Yeah, and like it was a thing of both like, well, I don't care, I don't. That's not a great trade off, and then it didn't happen anyway. So yeah, that did like there was like some good art that came out of the past 4 or 5 years, but it didn't. That was gonna and some good political art, but like that's just it was a silly idea.
Yeah, I think on average some art is going to come out over a 4 year period of time, but I don't think any of it isn't it. I don't think anything that we've seen. I mean, I certainly can't think of anything really being great art that is a direct reference to that moment in time. Although, like, now that I think about it, I don't know, having Bush as president, I don't know that like there are too many instances of really great art that you can point to that was a direct reference to that exact thing.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think during both presidencies, it's another case too where like, well, and during the Obama, like during any presidency, the loudest stuff is going to be the worst. Like, I don't think we live in an era where like the most subversive stuff is going to float to the top anymore. But yeah, I like watching like Bush era art. I saw Harold and Kumar go to Guantanamo Bay, which was I hadn't seen before. Not like a particularly great hard hitting satire.
No, but great art. I think we could agree it's great art.
Yeah, but it was like an interesting like this is Bush era satire like preserved in amber for us, and finding it actually like a little toothier than most of the big pieces of Trump era satire, which was a little depressing to think about. That like this was still felt like it had a little more bite to it than.
I know people like the new Borat movie, but I think like if you compare the two Borat movies, you can see how much Trump broke us, because I think the new one is just a lot. I don't think it has as you say, I don't think it has as hard of a bite. I think it is just a little dumber and a little goofier, and it's not. I mean, the satire just isn't. It's just not as good as it was the first time around, and maybe part of it is maybe part of it's just like, he's probably past that moment in time. But I also just think that it's just had a really profound impact on our ability to create good satire.
It is reassuring that still like because we're talking about the most visible stuff and the loudest stuff, but it's still always reassuring to me that like people are still making really radical work and angry work and subversive work, and that like they're hopefully those there become more ways to like foster that sort of thing. Like I just watched Empty Metal, which was like an amazing movie, and as radical as any sort of like piece of third cinema film I've ever seen. It's about a noise band that get recruited to assassinate killer cops, and it's like a really weird punk movie. It's kind of in the tradition of Born in Flames, and it's in dialogue with like indigenous sovereignty movements, and like it's like really weird and radical, and like not all of it works, but I kind of like that too because it's so messy, and watching stuff like that is like still really inspiring, and it feels so vital, and it's like a nice reminder that like, oh yeah, the good stuff is being made. Like it's just not, especially the way like talking about film, like the way film distribution is, it's just not being seen as much, but it's there for sure.
You're a political person from the standpoint of, that you are somebody who consciously thinks about politics and engages with politics and talks about politics. But do you feel that your work is inherently political?
The line I usually use is that I think all art is inherently political, but I don't think all art is politically useful. I would imagine that most people reading my comics would be able to suss out my politics pretty quickly, but I do not believe that my comics have much political use. But I do think art can be politically useful, and I do movement work that I think of as like a little separate. Like I do agitprop that I think of as like a separate thing for my comics and have separate goals and purposes for my comics. But and hopefully that is a little more useful. But I think of my comics as political. They're certainly in dialogue with political movements, but they're not converting anyone. I'm realistic about that, and they're probably not even educating anyone. So I'm making them for other reasons.
You touched on this a little bit. What does it mean to be politically useful? And do you think that can you point to a comic or even like a relatively recent comic that you feel like is politically useful in that way?
I think a lot of Sophie Yano's work falls into that category, but in particular, she did one about climate grief called "What Is a Glacier?" that I think is excellent. It's like very succinct. It's a really thoughtful and nuanced piece of writing, and like has a lot of emotion to it, like a very like sophisticated take on a very specific type of grief, but is also pretty useful as something that could be a piece of political education, or something that could mobilize someone reading it. And I think that is like an excellent comic example of that. And there are other artists who work, like Ron Wimberly is someone who I think, does such like a wide range of work, but Ben Passmore as well. I think would be good examples of like artists who are making work that like succeeds on an artistic level, but could be mobilizing in other ways.
Probably on a whole easier, maybe not easier, but more accessible in short form work. It sounds like, in terms of like actually getting something in front of somebody and educating them, and maybe even, changing their worldview is probably easier to do with a one-off comic than it is with a graphic novel where, they kind of already have to know about this world and really commit themselves to sitting down and consuming that one piece. I mean, I assume that like, for better or for worse, probably most or a lot of the people who would encounter your work are probably already kind of maybe possibly aligned with you to some degree.
Oh yeah, like I assume most of my audience are like already like communists and perverts like me. So I assume I'm like preaching to the choir, which is, yeah, again, why like when I do stuff that is specifically like agitprop, I am aware I'm speaking to a different audience, and I'm happy with. I sometimes feel like there's too much pressure, like when people talk about like whether or not artists, how artists should engage with politics, like they tend to assume that like they can only engage with it with their work, and like suddenly they have to like make protest art or something, and like that's cool. Like I think they should do that if they feel compelled to, and movements need artwork, like for sure, but that doesn't have to be the only way they enter the world, you know, because you're it's not just what you can do as an artist, it's like what you can do as a worker, what you can do as like a tenant or neighbor or member of a community or whatever. And I sometimes feel like in art people get too focused on like what they can do through their art when that's just one thing and will rarely be the most important thing.
It isn't. It isn't. I mean, obviously, it's not like it's not, as you say, it's not direct action. But for a lot of people, especially if you're a prominent artist, it is. It is a very. It's the most forward-facing thing that you put out into the world. Being compelled, though, is an interesting word. Do you feel that compulsion in your own work to be political, and do you feel like you've moved more in one of the directions as your career has progressed?
I don't, and part of that is because like I work in such like a, you know, I think I have like a healthy audience and a very supportive audience, but I work in such a niche thing that I don't really feel much pressure to write any which way. Like I feel like stuff can just come pretty naturally, and I write about the stuff that's on my mind, and frequently that will be things related to politics. And yeah, like I said, I think anyone would read my work and be able to like very quickly suss out a lot of my core beliefs. But I don't feel much pressure to write any which way, I find.
Obviously, for a lot of people, things have been bad for a long time, and I think a lot of people feel that things have been markedly worse in recent years. It really accelerated now over the past year. I certainly feel like I've become more political, and that my politics have shifted over the past 4 years, and
Mm.
particularly in the last year. When people feel desperate and uncomfortable, those things really start to surface in ways that they hadn't before.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are forced to, myself included, like re-examine aspects of their worldview because the world is changing pretty rapidly beneath them. Like it'd be hard to not take stock, and it's been interesting to see so many people take stock right now, and encouraging. You know, it's like it makes me feel optimistic that's happening.
Generally, when you look at the political events of the, particularly of the past year, where do they leave you? Are you encouraged? Are you more hopeless than before?
I think any socialist has to have like some amount of like suspending their disbelief because so much of it is like believing that left to our own devices we will actually like like build the equitable better world that, but like I don't have proof of that, you know, so like there has to be that.
It's that Homer Simpson quote of like, in theory, communism works in theory.
Yeah, like we just have to like we don't have the proof yet, we just have the hope, you know. And I think there's some amount of that, and then but yeah, I think of like when I think of 2020, I think of like some of the most intense feelings of despair I've ever had, but then also some of the most intense feelings of optimism I've ever had. And I'm sure it'll take me a while to really track.
To reconcile.
Yeah, because like some of the defining memories I have of 2020 were like the uprising, which like saw mass mobilization of people in a way that was like really inspiring and will have like long lasting implications. And like and on, you know, in Canada's side of things, like I don't know how much coverage there was of the pipeline blockades, or the railway blockades against the pipeline, and like things like that. 1492 land back was also a thing that happened in this country. And so yeah, the most optimistic I've ever felt and the most despair I've ever felt. And I think that's a lot of people where like the joy I felt at watching like a police precinct burn with the grief that like I think everyone is still processing of watching so many of your comrades get brutalized and seeing all the death counts and things like that. And I'm sure it will be a long time before we can really take stock of it, if we ever could, you know. So
Have you found that all that's transpired over the past year has had an impact on your ability to do work?
yeah, I've had a hard time. I think like most artists, I've had a hard time focusing. And I think it'd be wild if anyone could. Part of why I picked the daily comic I'm working on as a project is because it does take place on the moon amongst birds, and it feels like it's easier to focus on that than to write like a human being living on planet Earth right now, because like I don't know what that looks like. I don't even know what like it looks like in my own life anymore. So it's easier to write birds right now.
The work that's in the new book, these are stories that you have been working on over the years. But do you find that it's easier for you to work short form these days?
In general, I am always been more comfortable writing short stories. I've done graphic novel length things a few times now, but I still kind of think of myself as a short story specialist. And when I work on longer narratives, the way I tackle it is usually in small pieces, like a daily strip or a weekly strip. And then some of my other books, even though they come out like in one seamless thing, they were things that I was working on as like serials on Patreon, or breaking down into chapters, because I still tend to like focus on the small bits that it's just easier for me to manage.
I mean, is animation just kind of in your past at this point, or do you feel like it's something you might go back to?
Every now and then I'll pick up a freelance job in animation. The new Adventure Time specials I've done a small amount of work for, like some concept art. I think it's kind of past. I don't know how easily I'd be able to get back onto the animation schedule. When I was doing it, I was able to like work a full-time job and then devote about the same amount of hours to comics. But I don't think I can't just like power through all nighters like that anymore, because I was doing through that. So that's like through my, like, I got some all nighters in me still, but like I'd prefer not to if I can.
You get older and you can't really, you can't function the way you used to. Not that you're old, but like, your priorities change, but also you kind of change physiologically too.
Yeah. And the other thing too is like Adventure Time, like I really enjoyed working on, but it's not like I just loved animation design so much that I'd work on any show. And like I tried out for some other shows, a lot of them rejected me. So like it might not even be up to me. Like maybe I was like a right place, right time for Adventure Time, but there's a good chance I just like don't really mesh that well with the industry and its schedules, or other shows and its demands, and I'm totally fine with that.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that comics affords you, which like practically no other creative medium does, is that you really, barring some degree of outside influence, really get to create your vision from top to bottom.
Yeah, and I've been pretty lucky in that both Koyama Press and Drawn and Quarterly have always been extremely hands off, where sometimes I haven't even told them what a book was about before I sent it to them. And they've just always been very supportive, and hopefully pleasantly surprised by whatever shows up in their inbox.
So Peggy and Chris and Annie have never been like, what the fuck is this?
No, and like sometimes I've pitched them, like I think about some of the work I've done for them, and like they really took big chances on me, especially Anne starting out, where she hadn't worked that much in comics before. And when I sent her Lose, it was like in a medium, like the floppy pamphlet serialized medium that like had already proven itself to be not profitable at all to publish. And I wasn't a known quantity. I'd like done zines that no one had read before, and she like took a huge chance on me. And then like D&Q, when they printed Ant Colony, like that's a really expensive, annoying format. It's like a full color, kind of like wide book that doesn't go on shelves all that nicely. But in every case, they've just been like, all right, sure, like whatever you want. They'll sometimes tell me to make the type on the cover a little more legible, but that's about it.